They told us Burkina Faso was too small to matter, landlocked, poor, torn by violence. And yet, in a season of fear, a young captain stepped onto the stage and forced the world to look again. His name is Ibrahim Traoré. Admirers call him a defender. Critics warn he is a strongman in the making. But the real question for us isn't just who he is, it's what his rise reveals about justice, security, and human dignity in the Sahel, and why that matters to families like yours and mine. Tonight, we slow the scroll, take a breath, and weigh claims against consequences. In plain language. No shouting, no slogans. Just the careful, steady voice we reserve for moments that might echo through history. Can a firm hand stop terror without crushing liberty? Can a promise of dignity survive the temptations of power? And if it were your grandkids riding that bus, your church on the edge of danger, what kind of leadership would you pray for? This isn't a fan club and it isn't a takedown. It's a ledger. On one side, order, pride, the courage to stand up to outsiders who have long treated Africa like a chessboard. On the other, concentrated power, shortened patience for dissent, and the risk that emergency measures become a way of life. We'll examine the turning points you've seen in headlines and the quiet details you probably haven't, through the values many of us were raised with. The rule of law, the duty to protect the innocent, stewardship over resources, and a faith that steadies a nation when nothing else can. Stay with me to the end, because what happens in the Sahel rarely stays there. Security, migration, and the minerals inside your smartphone are already tied to this story more than you think. By the close of this episode, you'll have a clear lens for measuring leaders, any leader, by what they build, not just what they promise. If you believe justice and dignity still matter, lean in and ask yourself, when does strength serve freedom, and when does it threaten it? In the fall of 2022, Burkina Faso faced a breaking point. Whole regions of the country had fallen under the shadow of armed groups. Villages emptied overnight. Mothers walked for miles, carrying children toward safety. The government in Ouagadougou, once backed by France, seemed paralyzed, unable to protect its own people. Into that vacuum stepped a young officer named Captain Ibrahim Traoré. He wasn't a polished politician. He didn't come from a famous family or the old military elite. At just 34 years old, he represented something different, an impatient generation of soldiers who had grown up watching their elders fail to deliver peace. When his commanding officer began to lose control, Traoré and his comrades decided to act. In a year marked by 2 coups, the second one brought him to power. 2 days later, the capital's streets filled with chants and flags. A weary nation, desperate for stability, pinned its hope on a man barely older than many of their sons. To outsiders, it looked like yet another African coup. But to millions of Burkinabés, it felt like the first breath after drowning. Traoré's first speech was simple. We will take our destiny into our own hands. He spoke without notes in the language of soldiers and farmers, not diplomats. He refused luxury cars and wore the same camouflage uniform every day. He walked among troops on the front lines, ate from the same tin plates and quoted Thomas Sankara, the revolutionary once known as Africa's Che Guevara. The symbolism was deliberate: humility, courage, and defiance. But beneath that symbolism lies a harder truth. Revolutions built on hope can also breed fear. History reminds us that order gained by force often comes with a bill that the next generation must pay. For many Burkinabés, Traoré's arrival was salvation. For others, it raised old questions. How much power should one man hold, even in crisis? Older Americans watching from afar might recognize the pattern. We've seen strong figures rise in moments of national pain, promising protection, discipline, renewal. Sometimes they deliver. Sometimes they overreach. The tension between freedom and order is not foreign to us. It is written into our own constitution and our faith. Scripture tells us that power without wisdom leads to ruin, but it also reminds us that courage in defense of the innocent is no sin. Traoré's government moved fast. Within months, he expelled French troops, closed military bases, and sought new security partners, especially from Russia and Mali. Supporters hailed him as a liberator, breaking the last chains of colonial dependence. Critics warned that he was trading one influence for another. The truth, as always, sits somewhere in between. He did what many Western governments had failed to do for years: restore a sense of control. But at what cost? Reports from humanitarian agencies paint a mixed picture. Some towns indeed saw militant attacks drop. Others faced new restrictions on speech and movement. Journalists were detained. Opposition voices grew quieter. In the short term, stability seemed to return, but the long-term price was still unclear. For older viewers, this balance hits close to home. It echoes every hard choice between safety and liberty we've faced, from wartime security acts to the digital surveillance age. How much control are we willing to trade for the feeling of protection? And once granted, can that control ever be undone? Burkina Faso's story is not a headline, it's a mirror. It reflects the universal longing for leadership that protects without dominating, guides without silencing. Ibrahim Traoré became that mirror, showing both the light of courage and the shadow of unchecked authority. In that contrast lies the question every generation must answer: when does the protector become the ruler, and who dares to tell him when to stop? So far, Traoré's journey has captured hearts across Africa and stirred debates in Western capitals. But his biggest test isn't in speeches or parades. It's in the daily life of his people. The next chapter will ask, has he brought real safety or only a new kind of fear? The turning point came not on the battlefield, but in the court of world opinion. When Captain Traoré ordered French troops to leave Burkina Faso, it sent shockwaves far beyond West Africa. To many in Ouagadougou, it was a declaration of independence long overdue. To diplomats in Paris and Washington, it was a troubling signal that the region might be slipping into Moscow's orbit. But for ordinary people in the Sahel, this was not about geopolitics. It was about dignity. They had buried too many sons under foreign flags, watched too many promises dissolve into the dust. "We want our own future," one Burkina Faso teacher said, "even if it costs us." That sentence carries both pride and pain, because freedom always carries a bill. Traoré became a symbol, a kind of African David standing before the Goliath of global influence. His speeches against foreign domination went viral across the continent. Crowds waved not just Burkina Faso flags, but banners reading "Free Africa." In the markets, his portrait hung beside Sankaras and Mandelas. For millions who had long felt unseen, it was more than politics. It was personal redemption. But outside those cheering squares, the air grew colder. Western analysts warned that Burkina Faso's new alliances, particularly with Russia's Wagner-linked networks, could open new dangers. Reports of summary executions, restricted press, and civic repression began to surface. Traoré insisted these were lies spread by colonial powers seeking revenge. The truth, as always, was murkier, shifting between heroism and fear. For older Americans watching, it may sound familiar. The cycle of hope and concern echoes the post-war eras of countless nations, when leaders who began as saviors struggled against the temptation to become rulers for life. The founding fathers of our own republic warned that liberty must be watched like a fire that both warms and burns. The same wisdom echoes in the Psalms: "Put not your trust in princes." And yet, hope is a stubborn thing. Across Africa, especially among the youth, Traoré's defiance struck a chord. He spoke of African unity, of standing tall against foreign interference. Whether idealist or opportunist, he gave people a language of pride after decades of humiliation. Even those who feared his methods could not deny the emotional power of his message. The climax came in late 2023, when Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger announced a new alliance, an anti-terror, anti-interference pact they called the Alliance of Sahel States. Their message was simple. We will protect our borders, our faith, and our future on our own terms. The announcement electrified social media across Africa, but also set off alarms in Western capitals. The U.S. State Department urged caution. France called it a dangerous illusion. But for millions in the Sahel, it felt like destiny. What does America see in all this? On one hand, the rise of regional independence, countries finally standing on their own feet. On the other, a shrinking space for democracy and transparency. The tension between those two visions, freedom from domination versus freedom within one's own borders, is the moral storm now brewing across Africa. And perhaps that's the hardest truth for us to face. Every nation wants safety, pride, and purpose. But when those goals collide with fear and suspicion, justice becomes fragile. Power, once centralized, rarely lets go easily. What begins as a shield can quickly harden into armor that blocks accountability. Still, even in uncertainty, there are signs of light. Faith leaders across Burkina Faso continue to preach peace, reconciliation, and humility. In small villages, churches and mosques still serve as sanctuaries where soldiers and civilians pray side by side. Those quiet moments, unseen by cameras, may prove more powerful than any speech from a balcony. Because in the end, history doesn't remember who shouted the loudest. It remembers who stood for the weak when no one else would. And in that test, Captain Traoré's story is still being written. The question now is not whether he can command power, but whether he can control it. And that battle, as we'll see next, won't be fought with weapons, but with the hearts and trust of his own people. When the cheering faded and the flags came down, reality began its quiet return. The streets of Ouagadougou no longer roared with celebration, but with the hum of daily survival. Prices of rice and fuel rose. Schools reopened sporadically in safer areas, but many classrooms remained empty. Families displaced by violence waited for aid that came too slowly. And yet, in many corners of Burkina Faso, there was still a fragile sense of pride, a feeling that, for once, their destiny wasn't dictated by someone else's accent. In the months that followed Traoré's rise, his government moved to centralize control over media and civic groups. Officials said it was necessary to protect national unity. Critics saw the early signs of silence settling over public life. Independent journalists were summoned for questioning. Foreign correspondents found their access restricted. The national mood shifted, from open debate to cautious whispers. You have to choose your words now. One local pastor told a European reporter, "Even prayer sounds political." But not all consequences were dark. In the countryside, some villages reclaimed roads once lost to militants. Local markets reopened. Community patrols, ordinary citizens armed with whistles and courage, stood guard at night. For them, the new government wasn't an abstraction. It was hope wearing camouflage. Still, the deeper scars were spiritual. Years of fear and betrayal had left people skeptical of every promise. The Burkinabe are a deeply faithful people, Christian, Muslim, traditional. But faith had been tested. Many turned back to their churches and mosques, not out of politics, but out of weariness. "We've had too many leaders," one elderly farmer said. "Now we ask only for peace." For Americans over 50 watching this story, that weariness feels familiar. It echoes the disillusionment after wars, after scandals, after promises that proved hollow. The same question haunts every generation. How do you rebuild trust once it's been broken? Politically, Traoré consolidated his power. The Transitional Council extended his term until stability is achieved. Western governments expressed concern, but offered little leverage. Few dared to alienate a leader who still commanded broad popular support. The United Nations called for free elections when conditions permit. Yet for many Burkinabés, the very phrase "conditions permit" sounded like an endless postponement of democracy. And then came the ripple effect. Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso began acting as one bloc, sharing intelligence, expelling foreign troops, and shaping a new identity of African sovereignty. Across the continent, young people saw in Traoré not just a man, but a mirror, a symbol that courage could rewrite fate. But older citizens, those who had lived through past revolutions, whispered caution. Every revolution begins with fire, one bishop warned, but fire can warm or destroy. Economically, the country faced a paradox. With foreign aid reduced and partnerships shifting eastward, new trade channels opened, but often at higher political costs. Chinese and Russian contractors filled roles once held by Western firms. Infrastructure improved in places, but transparency worsened. The promise of independence collided with the complexity of interdependence, and so, by 2025, Burkina Faso stood at a crossroads, part pride, part fatigue, part uncertainty. To the outside world, Traoré was either a visionary or a warning. To his own people, he was both at once, the man who gave them back their voice, and the man who decided when they could use it. In this moment of tension, faith quietly reclaimed its role as the moral compass. Churches organized food drives for displaced families. Imams preached against vengeance. In the absence of trust in politics, spiritual communities became the last anchor of dignity. When the palace loses its truth, a priest said, the altar must not. It's a sentiment Americans of faith understand well. When government falters, the burden of compassion shifts to ordinary people, to congregations, to neighbors, to anyone who refuses to let cynicism win. And maybe that's the real lesson from Burkina Faso. The dignity doesn't wait for permission from power. It lives in small acts, bread shared, prayers whispered, truth told even softly. But the question remains, can a movement built on faith and fire survive the test of time? And what happens when the world starts watching less? For many Americans watching from a distance, the rise of Ibrahim Traoré may feel like another faraway drama, something that belongs to Africa's long struggle with instability. But look closer, and the reflection becomes uncomfortably familiar. We, too, know what it means to trade freedom for security in moments of fear. We've watched the pendulum swing between liberty and control, between idealism and pragmatism. After 9/11, after wars and recessions, after waves of disinformation, we've wrestled with the same questions that haunt the Sahel. How much power should one leader hold? How do you protect your people without losing their trust? Traoré's story is not about geography. It's about human nature. When a leader promises protection, the heart responds before the mind does. We crave safety. We admire strength. And yet, our own history reminds us. Strength without restraint is just another form of weakness. The founders of this republic built a system of checks and balances precisely because they knew that even noble intentions can turn dangerous when left unchecked. Globally, Traoré's defiance has forced uncomfortable conversations. Nations that once dictated Africa's path are now being told no. That no echoes with moral weight. It's the sound of a continent asking for dignity, not charity. For many Africans, it's a spiritual awakening, not just a political one. And whether America likes it or not, that awakening will reshape alliances, trade, and trust for decades to come. The real question for us isn't how Washington should respond. It's how we, as citizens of a free nation, interpret what freedom means when others claim it differently. Will we see Traoré's movement as a threat or as a reminder that self-determination is a right, not a privilege granted by global powers? For older Americans, especially those grounded in faith and experience, This is a moment to watch with wisdom, not haste. The Bible warns, judge not by appearance, but judge with right judgment. Justice demands discernment, not reflex. We can hope for Burkina Faso's peace without turning away from its pain. We can respect independence without excusing oppression. Because whether in Africa or America, the same truth endures. Power without virtue is perilous, but faith without action is hollow. And that brings us to the hardest question of all, the one every generation must face before history closes its ledger. What kind of world do we leave behind when the strong are gone and the meek are left to rebuild? History rarely ends with applause. It ends with questions, often whispered long after the noise has faded. Ibrahim Traoré's story is still unfolding, but the lessons it carries are as old as humanity itself. The struggle between power and principle, between fear and faith, between control and compassion. What began as a cry for dignity may yet become a cautionary tale. Every generation faces this tension. We want safety, but we also want freedom. We want justice, but we fear disorder. And so, time and again, we look to strong leaders to heal our wounds. Sometimes they do. Sometimes they deepen them. The burden of discernment, dear friends, always falls on the people. Burkina Faso stands today at a fragile crossroads, caught between pride and peril. Its story reminds us that justice is not a flag or a speech. It's a daily labor, feeding the hungry, protecting the weak, restraining the powerful, and telling the truth even when it costs you. For Americans who have lived long enough to see ideals tested, this lesson rings close to home. We've seen faith twisted and hope commercialized, yet we've also seen grace rebuild what politics alone could not. If there is a warning here, it's this: the world's quiet corners still watch us. The example America sets, how we defend liberty, how we treat strangers, how we balance might with mercy, echoes far beyond our borders. And if we expect others to choose justice over domination, we must show that justice still breathes here too. So tonight, as we close, I ask you not to choose sides, but to choose sight, to see the human faces behind the headlines, to pray for wisdom, for leaders, for nations, for ourselves. Because true strength isn't measured in soldiers or slogans. It's measured in restraint, in humility, in the courage to say, enough. If you believe that human dignity is not negotiable, carry this question into your week. When does strength serve freedom, and when does it threaten it? And may we all, wherever we are, have the faith to tell the difference. May God bless Africa, a land of hope and dignity, and may He bless America, that we never forget what those words mean.